I'm a farmer, and I caged Bigfoot when I caught him stealing my animals. While the Sasquatch was on a rampage, I finally managed to catch him. But what I didn't know yet at the time was that this would soon become the biggest regret of my life because of what Bigfoot did to my animals next. My name is Ray. I am 54 years old. I have farmed the same 212 acres in rural eastern Oregon for 26 years, the same land my father farmed before me and his father before him. It was late September. The nights had turned cold and clear, the kind of high desert autumn that makes the stars look closer than they should. I went out at 5 in the morning to check the chickens the way I do every morning, and I found the coop broken into. Not by a coyote. I know coyote damage. I have been fighting coyotes on this land for 26 years, and I know the signature: the dug under, the torn wire, the scattered feathers, the small bones. This was not that. The wire on the east side of the coop had been pulled away from the frame. Not cut, not chewed. Pulled. The staples drawn cleanly out of the wood as if they had been extracted one by one with a tool. The frame itself was intact. 4 birds were gone. The remaining birds were alive but pressed into the far corner in a silence I had never heard from chickens before. Not the noise of disturbed birds. The silence of birds that have decided that making any sound at all is a mistake. I stood in that coop for a long time, looking at the pulled staples. I have a neighbor, Walt, who runs sheep on the parcel to the north of mine. I called him that morning. He had lost 2 lambs the week before. He had chalked it up to cougar, which is not unreasonable in this country. I asked him to describe the kill site. He described something that did not match the cougar. No drag marks, no cached carcass, no bite pattern. The lambs were simply gone, as if they had been picked up and carried. I did not say what I was thinking. Walt is a practical man, and I am a practical man, and neither of us was going to say the word Bigfoot out loud. Not then, not to each other. That word belongs to a category of things that practical men in this part of Oregon do not say in serious conversation, and we were both working very hard to stay in serious conversation. I reinforced the co-op that afternoon. New wire, heavier gauge, doubled up on the staples. I ran a hot wire along the bottom of the frame. I put a padlock on the door. 3 nights later, 4 more birds were gone. The hot wire had been triggered. I could see where something had contacted it, the burn mark on the grass below the frame. Whatever it was had taken the shock, processed it, and continued. The heavy gauge wire was still in place, but the boards on the north side of the coop had been separated at the joint, the nails backing out of the wood with the same deliberate precision as the staples before them. A gap 6 inches wide, top to bottom. 6 inches is not enough for a coyote. It is not enough for a bear. It is barely enough for a determined raccoon, and a raccoon does not pull nails. I set up a camera. I set it on the post at the northeast corner of the coop yard, angled to cover the north wall. I ran a second one on the barn roof, covering the approach from the tree line. I checked them the next morning. The post camera was on the ground. Not fallen, the mount had been disassembled. The wing nut backed off the bolt, and the camera lifted free. It was sitting in the grass 6 feet from the post, face up, the way you set something down when you want to put it somewhere safe. The memory card was still in it. The last frame on the card was a wall of darkness with something at the right edge that I have looked at many times since. A shape, the lower portion of something. A leg, perhaps, or a forearm. Something large. The barn roof camera was still in place. It had captured nothing. Its field of view ended at the fence line, and whatever had been at the coop had approached from a different angle than I had anticipated. Something was taking my animals. It was large. The force required to extract staples and back out nails spoke to significant size and hand strength. It was intelligent. The camera removal, the approach angle that avoided my second camera, the hot wire shock absorbed and adapted to. It was returning on a 3-day cycle, which meant it had a range and a pattern, and I was a predictable stop on it. I decided to build a trap. I want to be specific about this because people have asked me since if I knew what I was trapping. The honest answer is, I suspected. The word Bigfoot had been sitting at the back of my mind like a splinter I was not ready to dig out. I had grown up in this country, and I had heard the stories my whole life, at the feed store, at the diner, from the older ranchers who had been on their land long enough to have things happen that they did not talk about in mixed company. I had always filed those stories in the same place I filed most things I could not verify. Not dismissed, not accepted, just held. Now I was standing in my coop, looking at pulled staples and doing the arithmetic, and the arithmetic kept arriving at the same answer. But what I told myself I was building was a large animal trap, something that would hold whatever was taking my birds long enough for me to get a look at it and make a decision about what to do next. That is what I told myself. I built it from livestock panels, the heavy welded wire panels I use for cattle working pens. 8 panels, each 16 feet long and 52 inches tall, wired together at the corners with doubled fence wire. A frame of 4-inch steel posts driven 3 feet into the ground at each corner and at the midpoint of each long side. I roofed it with 2 additional panels laid flat and secured with wire at every junction. The door was a sliding panel of the same material, counterweighted with a bag of concrete, so it would drop fast when the trigger released. The trigger was a pressure plate, a section of 1/2-inch plywood mounted on a spring mechanism over a shallow pit at the center of the enclosure. 30 pounds of pressure would release the door. I put the trigger under a pile of fresh straw with 4 chickens inside the enclosure, living birds that would make noise and draw something in. I built this in a day and a half. My wife, Carol, watched me build it and did not ask what I was trapping. She knows me well enough to know that when I am building something with that much steel, the conversation about why can wait until the thing is done. She brought me coffee in the afternoon and stood at the edge of the yard looking at the structure. She said, "That's a serious cage." I said, "It's a serious problem." She went back inside. I ran the game camera on the barn roof again, repositioned to cover the cage. I went to bed at 10. I set an alarm for 1 in the morning. I did not sleep much. At 1, I got up, dressed, and went out to the porch. Cold, mid-30s, clear, the moon 3/4 full, and throwing hard shadows across the yard. The cage was 40 feet from the porch. I could see it clearly. The chickens inside had quieted. I stood on the porch for an hour. Nothing came. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table with the light off and the window open until 3:15. Then I went back to bed. The alarm went off at 4:30. I was out the door by 4:32. The cage door was down. I stopped walking when I saw it, stood in the yard with the flashlight in my hand and the beam on the cage, and I did not move for what was probably 30 seconds. The door was down. The chickens were visible through the wire, alive, clustered at the far end of the enclosure, and in the center of the cage, standing with its back to me, was something I had no category for. It was facing away. That was the first thing. Facing away from me toward the tree line, as if it had been looking at the trees when the door came down and had not yet turned around. It was standing, fully upright, no crouch, just standing, occupying the space the way a person occupies a room. The top of it was above the roof line of the cage, the panels bowing slightly upward under pressure, even though the roof wire was secured at every junction. It was taller than my cage. My cage was 52 inches, 4'4". What was inside it was taller than that. The roof wire was bowing upward under the pressure of its head and shoulders. I will tell you what I felt in that moment because it is relevant to what I did next. I felt the specific satisfaction of a problem solved. For about 4 seconds, a trap I built from livestock panels and a concrete counterweight had done what I built it to do, and the part of my brain that solves problems registered the completion of the task before the other parts of my brain caught. Then it turned around. I have spent a lot of time since trying to find the right language for that moment, and I am not sure the right language exists. It turned around in the cage the way you turn around in a small room, carefully because the space was barely adequate, shifting its weight with a precision that told me it knew exactly where its body was in the space at all times. And when it was facing me, it looked at me. I have made eye contact with a lot of animals in 26 years of farming. Cattle, horses, dogs, coyotes, the occasional deer at the fence line in the morning. I know animal eye contact. I know what it looks like when something is registering you as a stimulus. This was not that. What looked at me through the wire of my livestock panels was making an assessment, a structured, patient, detailed assessment of the situation, the cage, the door, me, the distance between me and it, the flashlight, the yard, the house behind me. Its eyes moved, not the rapid scan of prey or the fixed lock of predator. A methodical inventory, the way you look at a room when you're trying to understand all of it at once. It knew it was caught, and it was deciding what to do about it. I backed up 3 steps without making a decision to back up. My boots found the ground, and I moved backward, and I did not take my flashlight off its face. The face. I am going to describe this plainly, because plainly is the only way I know how to talk, and dressing it up would not make it more true. The face was not human, but the proportions of it, the spacing of the eyes, the presence of a brow, the architecture of the jaw, were in the neighborhood of humans in a way that no animal I have encountered has been. It had hair across the forehead, reddish dark, the same material as the rest of it. The eyes were set forward like a predator's. The nose was broader than a human nose. The jaw was substantial in a way that suggested significant bite force. But the eyes were what stopped me from backing up further. Not because they were frightening, because they were considering me the same way I was considering them, with the same quality of organized attention, the same inventory. I had caught something that was thinking about being caught. I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table, and I am not too proud to tell you that my hands were not steady when I put the flashlight down. Carol came downstairs at 5. She looked at my face, and then out the kitchen window at the cage, and then at my face again. She said, "What is it?" I said, "I don't know exactly." She said, "Is it hurt?" That question had not occurred to me yet. I said, "I don't think so. I don't know." She went to the window. From the kitchen you could see the shape of it through the wire in the early light, the size of it, the way it was standing. Carol has lived on this land for 23 years. She is not a woman who frightens easily, and she is not a woman who pretends things are not what they are. She said, "Ray, that's not an animal." I said, "I know." She said, "Is it a Bigfoot?" I had not said the word out loud yet, not once since this started. I had held it at the back of my mind for 2 weeks and built a cage around the suspicion without ever naming it directly. And now my wife was saying it plainly, the way she said everything. I said, "I think so." She was quiet. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I did not have an answer. I had built the trap to solve a problem, and I had solved it. And now I had a different problem that was significantly larger than the first one, and I had no framework for it at all. I had a list forming in my head of people I could call: the county sheriff, the state wildlife agency, the university extension office, and I was working through that list and finding that none of those calls made sense. What do you say? I have a Bigfoot in a livestock panel cage in my yard, and I need someone to come and collect it? The sheriff would send a deputy who would call his supervisor, who would call someone else, and by the end of the chain, there would be federal agencies and university researchers and wildlife photographers, and every single one of them would be making decisions about something in my yard that I had built and caught and was responsible for. There is no protocol for a captured Bigfoot. I have looked since. There is genuinely no protocol. I went back outside at 6. It had sat down, not collapsed, not cowering. Sat down the way you sit when you have been standing for a while and have decided that standing is no longer the most efficient use of your energy. Cross-legged on the ground, which meant it understood the geometry of the space well enough to know that sitting was viable, where standing was a strain. The chickens had moved to within a few feet of it, which told me something about its smell or its energy, or something I do not have a word for. Prey animals do not voluntarily approach predators. Those chickens had made a calculation. I walked to within 10 feet of the cage. It looked at me, the same quality of attention as before, organized, patient, not aggressive. It glanced at the cage door, at the counterweight, at the mechanism I had used to trigger the drop. Its gaze moved across the components with the systematic thoroughness of something that was reverse engineering what had happened to it. That is when I understood that the cage was not going to hold. Not because the steel was inadequate. 4-inch posts driven 3 feet into rocky eastern Oregon soil are not going anywhere. Not because the wire was too light. A 16-gauge livestock panel is rated for cattle, and it held. The cage would hold, but whatever was in it had already figured out how the door worked. I could see it in the way its attention had moved across the mechanism. Give it time and privacy, and it would solve the door. Maybe not today, maybe not by brute force, though I did not discount brute force given the evidence of what it had done to my coop, but it would solve it. I had maybe a day. I went back inside and I told Carol what I was thinking. She said, "Then you need to decide before the day is up." She was right. I had 3 options. Call someone, and if so, who and what happens after. Release it, open the door, and step back. Or keep it and figure out next steps from there. The call option kept failing because I could not identify a single institution I trusted to handle this decently. I have dealt with government agencies my entire farming life. I know how institutions handle things they have no category for, badly, and in ways that benefit the institution more than the thing. Whatever was in that cage was not a specimen. I watched it think. I was not going to hand it to people who would treat it like one. The keep it option failed because I had already watched it study my cage door, and I did not have enough livestock panels to build something it couldn't eventually solve. That left the release option. I did not act on the release option immediately. I want to be honest about why. I was not ready. I had built a trap for a reason, and the reason had not resolved itself, and releasing it felt like admitting the reason was wrong. So instead, I went back out to the cage at 9 in the morning, and I stood 10 feet from it, and I watched. It had moved since 6. It was no longer sitting cross-legged. It had shifted to the east side of the enclosure and was standing, one hand on the wire, its weight distributed the way weight distributes when you have been standing for a while, and your body is managing the fatigue without complaint. It was looking northeast, not at me, not at the house, northeast. The direction of the tree line beyond my property boundary, the direction it had come from. I had the distinct impression that it was tracking something, not visually. Nothing was visible from where it stood. Something else, sound maybe, or something I do not have a word for because I do not have the equipment to perceive it. I went inside and got my notebook. I came back out and I sat in the folding chair I use for morning chores, and I started writing down what I was observing the way I write down everything I observe on this property that I do not have an immediate explanation for. It is a habit from 26 years of farming. If you cannot explain it yet, record it. Something I wrote down that morning, 9:15, right hand on wire at shoulder height, fingers curled around the gauge in a grip that is not testing the wire, is just resting there, left arm at its side, eyes oriented northeast, breathing slow, deliberate, deeper rhythm than what I would expect from something at rest, not distress, not a panting or a starved breath. The breath of something that is using its respiratory system for something other than simple oxygenation. Listening maybe, receiving. At 9:40 it turned its head and looked at me, not with surprise. It knew I was there. It had known I was there from the moment I sat down. The turn of the head was not a response to my presence. It was something else. An acknowledgement, maybe, a check. The way you look at someone in the room when you want to confirm they are still there before you go back to whatever you were attending to. It looked at me for about 8 seconds. Then it looked northeast again. I wrote that down too. I want to tell you what it is like to sit 10 feet from a caged Bigfoot for 3 hours on a September morning, because people have asked me since, and I have not known how to answer. The honest answer is that it was the most concentrated observation I have ever done in 26 years of farming, which is a life spent in close daily attention to living things. I have watched cattle and horses and dogs and working animals of every kind. I know what animals look like across the range of their states: contentment, fear, hunger, illness, the particular unease of an animal that senses weather changing. I have a large catalog, and I know how to read it. What was in that cage did not fit the catalog, not because it was alien, because it was too close. The attention it directed at its environment was organized in a way that kept making me feel I was observing something that was also observing me. Not defensively, not aggressively, but with the same quality of systematic interest that I was bringing to it. I kept catching myself adjusting my posture, the way you adjust your posture when you become aware that someone is watching you work. It was not watching me work. It was doing what it was doing, but the quality of its ambient awareness kept producing that response in me. At 10, I wrote, "This is not like watching an animal. This is like sitting in a room with someone." I crossed that out and wrote it again and left it. The morning went on. Carol brought me coffee at 10 and stood behind the chair for a minute, looking at the cage. She did not say anything. She went back inside. At 10:30, the thing in the cage sat back down, cross-legged again, and closed its eyes. not sleep. The rhythm of the breathing changed, but remained deliberate, and the posture did not have the slackness of sleep. Something more like what I have seen horses do when they are conserving energy but remaining alert. A very particular kind of rest. I sat with it for another hour. What I kept coming back to, sitting in that folding chair in the September morning, was the chicken. A single bird had climbed into the thing's lap at some point between 6 and 9. It was still there when I came out at 9. A Rhode Island red hen, one of the older ones, sitting in its lap the way a hen sits when it has found a satisfactory perch and sees no reason to move. The thing had not moved it, was not touching it, just sitting with a chicken in its lap, the chicken apparently unbothered, and the two of them oriented in the same direction. I do not know what to do with that image. I have thought about it a great deal. Prey animals do not voluntarily approach predators. That hen had made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion and acted on the conclusion, and the calculation had not produced any outcome the hen appeared to regret. I have run chickens on this land for 26 years, and I have a sense for how they rid situations. What that hen had read in the thing in the cage was not a predator, which meant I did not know what it was, which meant the word Bigfoot, which I had been holding at arm's length for 2 weeks, was not the end of the understanding. It was just the beginning of it. At noon, I went inside and ate lunch and made a decision. I was going to release it. I was going to walk out to the cage with the bolt cutters, cut the counterweight wire, and open the door and step back and let it go. I had spent 6 hours watching something that was not what I had thought I was trapping, and I was not willing to keep it through a second night. I told Carol. She nodded and said, "Do you want me there?" I said no. She said, "I'll be at the window." I went out with the bolt cutters at 12:30. It was standing when I came out, not the way it had been standing at 9, with one hand on the wire and the attention oriented away. It was facing the door when I came through the back gate, fully upright, both arms at its sides, watching me cross the yard with the bolt cutters in my hand. It knew what the bolt cutters were for. I want to be careful about that claim because I have made a lot of claims in this account, and I want to hold the line between what I observed and what I inferred. What I observed was that it watched my approach to the counterweight mechanism with the same quality of attention it had given to the cage architecture that morning, organized, tracking, following the logic of what was happening, and that when I positioned the bolt cutters on the wire and looked up at it, its weight shifted forward, not lunging, not rushing the door, the slight lean of something that has been waiting for a particular moment and has just recognized its arrival. I cut the wire, the counterweight dropped, the door went up. I stepped back to the far edge of the yard and I watched. It did not move immediately. It stood at the open door for what felt like a long time, 30 seconds, perhaps 40, looking at the opening, looking at me across the yard, looking at the tree line beyond the fence. I have spent time thinking about what those 30 or 40 seconds contained. The most practical version is simple: a cautious animal assessing whether the open door was a new kind of trap before committing to it. The version I keep returning to, the one I cannot dismiss, is that something more like a decision was being made. Not about whether to leave, that was already decided. About something else, something I was part of. It took 3 steps toward me. I want to say clearly that I did not run, not because I was brave, because the fear response was slower than the situation. By the time my body understood it should be afraid, it was already over. 3 steps, which put it approximately 6 feet from where I was standing, and then it stopped. 6 feet. I could see the individual hairs at its brow line. I could see the specific color differentiation in the fur where the chest darkened relative to the arms. I could see the size of its hands in a way the cage wire had not allowed, the full unobstructed fact of them, the length of the fingers relative to the palm, the thickness of the joints. These were the hands that had pulled my staples. They were twice the size of mine. It looked at me for what I estimated was 15 seconds. A specific, organized attention, the same inventory it had run through the cage wire that morning, applied now to my face at 6 feet. I did not move. I did not speak. I breathed as steadily as I could manage, and I held the bolt cutters at my side, and I looked back. Then it turned, walked to the fence at the northeast corner of the property, stepped over the top wire the way I would step over a low curb, and went north, straight north, toward the pasture, toward the cattle pen 200 yards up the slope. I did not understand the direction immediately. I thought it was simply the most direct route to the tree line, and I stood at the edge of my yard and watched it go, and I thought, it is done. The problem is resolved. I made the right call. Then I heard the cattle. The cattle pen is 200 yards north of the main yard, past the barn, at the edge of the property where the pasture meets the tree line. I run 23 head on that pasture in the fall. I have run cattle on this land for 26 years. I know every sound they make in every condition, in heat, in cold, in the presence of a coyote at the perimeter, in the hours before a weather change. I know the sound of a herd that has been startled, and the sound of a herd that has been hurt, and the sound of a herd that has simply smelled something it does not recognize. What I heard coming from the north pasture as I went through the back gate was none of those things. I was running by the time I came around the barn. The fence was down on the east side of the pen. 2 rails snapped clean at the midpoint, the posts they had been nailed to pulled from the ground and lying in the pasture grass, still attached to the nails. Something had gone through the fence rather than over it, not a gap, through, in the way that something goes through a thing when the thing is simply not a relevant obstacle. The herd was bunched at the far west corner, pressed together in the way prey animals press when they have identified a threat and run out of options. All 20 of them accounted for, all of them alive. All of them were as still as I have ever seen 20 cattle be at once, which is a kind of stillness I did not know cattle were capable of producing. 3 of the younger steers were not in the corner. I will tell you what I found in the order I found it, and I will tell you plainly, and I will not describe it in more detail than the account requires. The first steer was at the edge of the pasture near the irrigation ditch. It had not been dragged there. It had not been fed upon. What had been done to it had been done quickly, and had been done by something operating at a level of force I have no comparison for in 26 years of ranching. The second steer was 20 yards further north, the same. The third I found at the north fence line, against the wire. I stood in that pasture for a long time. I had released it. That is the thing I kept coming back to, standing there in the September morning with the sun fully up and the shadow of the barn cutting across the pasture grass behind me. I had released it. I had made the decision I thought was the right one. I had walked out with the bolt cutters and cut the counterweight wire and opened the door and stepped back and watched it walk north. And the direction it walked had told me nothing. And I had stood at the edge of my yard and thought, the problem is resolved. 3 steers at the north fence line told me something different about what the problem had actually been. I understand now what 11 hours in a cage 4 feet 4 inches tall does to something that has spent its whole life moving through open country. I had watched the intelligence across those 11 hours. The inventory, the assessment, the patience, the chicken sitting unbothered in its lap. I had watched all of it, and I had made a calculation about what it was. I had not made an adequate calculation about what 11 hours of confinement was doing to what it was underneath the intelligence. I stood in my north pasture, and I looked at the tree line where it had gone, and I thought about the 15 seconds of eye contact at 6 feet before it turned. About the specific quality of that attention, about what it had been deciding in those 15 seconds that I had not understood it was deciding. I think it had already decided about the cattle before it looked at me. I think the 15 seconds were something else. I have farmed this land for 26 years, and I have dealt with losses before, to weather, to disease, to coyotes, and the occasional cougar. Losses are part of this work. You account for them, and you absorb them. And you keep going because stopping is not a viable option on a working farm. I absorbed this one. I kept going. I stood in that pasture with the September morning clear and cold around me and the tree line quiet to the north, and I understood, in a way that I had not understood before that morning, the size of what I had been dealing with. I had built a trap to solve a problem. What I had not understood until I was standing in my north pasture looking at the tree line was the size of the problem I was actually dealing with.